I was under my car, covered in grime, wrestling with an oil filter that just would not budge, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. And I swear, checking it in that moment was probably the biggest mistake I've ever made. The first text from Chloe was just one line, but it hit me like a physical blow. It said, "I'm at the airport. I'm going to Europe." Before I could even process what that meant, another one popped up, "You deal with Emma. Don't argue." I just lay there, oil dripping onto my arm, staring at the screen. My hands were thick with grease, and my mind just couldn't make sense of it. Because this wasn't a conversation we'd had. This wasn't a plan we'd made. This was just her telling me she was gone. My coworker, David, walked past, and he must have seen my face because he stopped dead. He asked if I was okay, and I honestly couldn't even answer him. I was still trying to figure out if this was real life, or if I was having some kind of twisted nightmare right there in the middle of my shift. I scrambled up from under the car, wiping my hands on a rag, and read the messages again. They hadn't changed. My wife had just left the country and abandoned our 1-year-old daughter without a single word of warning. I called her 3 times, and every single call went straight to voicemail, like she'd already turned her phone off, or maybe even blocked me. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't some impulsive decision she'd made that morning. This was planned. This was something she'd been setting up for weeks, maybe even months, and I'd been too exhausted, too trusting, to see it coming. Let me back up for a second, because I need you to understand how we even got here. I met Chloe 4 years ago at a restaurant in Deep Ellum. She was this confident, outgoing woman who just seemed to have her life together in a way I didn't. She was 7 years older than me, and at the time, I thought that was exciting. She knew what she wanted, she didn't play games. We got married at the courthouse 8 months later because she said she didn't need some big wedding to prove we were committed. Honestly, I was relieved, because I didn't have the money for anything fancy. Things were good for about a year, and then she got pregnant. I'm not going to lie, I freaked out when she told me. I was 23, working at a repair shop, barely making enough to cover rent. But she seemed so happy about it. She talked about baby names and nursery colors, and I convinced myself that maybe this was what we needed to feel like a real family. But the second Emma was born, something shifted. Chloe stopped looking at me the way she used to. She started going out with her friends more and more. She'd come home at 2 in the morning, smelling like alcohol and cigarettes. And when I'd ask where she'd been, she'd just say she needed time to herself. "I'm losing myself," she'd say whenever I brought it up. "I need to remember who I am outside of being a mom." And I tried to be understanding. I really did. But there's a difference between needing space and completely checking out of your own life. Back at the shop, I texted her back and told her we needed to talk immediately, but she didn't respond. I called Emma's daycare, where she was supposed to be until 5. The woman who answered sounded surprised when I said I needed to pick her up early. She asked if everything was okay, and I didn't know how to explain that my wife had just fled the country without telling me. So I just said there was a family emergency. David came over and saw me grabbing my jacket. I told him I had to leave right now. "Go," he said, without even asking questions. "We'll cover for you." I got in my car, heart pounding, because I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't checked my phone. If I'd worked my full shift and shown up at 5, only to find out Chloe never arranged for anyone to get Emma. The woman at the daycare handed Emma over and gave me this look like she knew something was very wrong, but she didn't push it. Emma smiled when she saw me, reaching her little arms out, and I felt this wave of anger wash over me. How could Chloe just leave her like this? How could she look at this perfect little kid and decide she mattered less than some trip to Europe? I drove home, my hands shaking the whole time. When I got to our apartment, I half expected Chloe to be there with some explanation that would make this all make sense. But the apartment was empty. And that's when I saw it, her closet was half cleared out. She'd packed. She'd actually packed suitcases and planned this whole thing without saying a single word to me. I put Emma in her playpen and opened my phone. And that's when I saw Chloe had posted on social media. It was a photo of her at the airport, with a huge smile, and the caption said, "Finally free," with a plane emoji and a champagne glass emoji. I screenshotted it immediately, because even in that moment, I knew I was going to need proof of this. I opened a new folder on my phone and labeled it Evidence. I saved the screenshot along with her text messages. Then I turned off notifications from her number, but I didn't block her. I wanted to see every single thing she sent me from this point forward. Every text, every post, every piece of evidence that would prove what kind of person she really was. I sat on the couch with Emma playing at my feet, and I realized I had no idea what to do next. I didn't know how to take care of a 1-year-old by myself. Chloe had always handled the feeding schedules and the nap times and all the little details that keep a kid alive. I was spiraling when I remembered Sarah. Sarah was Chloe's cousin, and the two of them hated each other for reasons I'd never fully understood. Chloe had told me once that Sarah was judgmental and controlling, but every time I'd met Sarah, she'd seemed perfectly nice. I texted her and said I needed help, and she responded in less than 5 minutes. She asked what happened, and I sent her a screenshot of Chloe's text. Sarah called me immediately. "I'm coming over," she said, and I could hear the anger in her voice. "Don't worry about anything." She showed up an hour later, still wearing her scrubs from her shift at the hospital. She walked in, took one look at me, and asked if I'd fed Emma. I admitted I'd given her some crackers and a juice box. Sarah just nodded and went straight to the kitchen. She made dinner for Emma, gave her a bath, and then sat me down and wrote out a schedule on a sticky note. Feed, bath, books, bed. "You're going to follow this every single night," she said. "I'll help you twice a week, but you need to learn how to do this yourself, because I'm not moving in." I nodded and felt this weird sense of relief, because at least someone was on my side. That night, after Emma was asleep, I sat in the quiet apartment and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. Chloe had been chaos for so long, and now that she was gone, everything felt strangely calm. I opened my phone and looked at the evidence folder, and I realized this was just the beginning. I had no idea what she was really planning, but I knew one thing for sure: when she came back, she was going to find out that I wasn't the same guy she'd left behind. The first week without Chloe was brutal in ways I didn't expect. I thought the hardest part would be the physical stuff, like changing diapers and making meals, but honestly, that became routine pretty fast. The real nightmare was the sleep deprivation. Emma would wake up crying at midnight, then again at 2, then again at 4, and every time I'd stumble into her room, half asleep, wondering how single parents do this without losing their minds. I started keeping a notebook by my bed where I'd write down everything that happened each day, because Sarah told me I needed to document everything in case this turned into a custody battle. So I'd write things like, "Emma ate half a banana and threw the rest on the floor," or "temperature was normal, no fever," or "Chloe posted a photo from London, didn't ask about Emma." It felt paranoid at first, but then I realized this notebook was becoming the most important thing I owned. Every page was proof that I was here doing the work while Chloe was out there pretending she didn't have a child. Work became this weird escape where I could just focus on brake jobs and oil changes without thinking about anything else. But David started pulling me aside more and more to ask if I was doing okay. I'd show up with bags under my eyes and coffee stains on my shirt, and he'd just shake his head, like he couldn't believe what I was going through. The guys at the shop were good about covering for me when I needed to leave early for daycare pickup, but I could tell they were starting to worry about me. I was making stupid mistakes, like forgetting to tighten bolts or leaving tools in places they shouldn't be. And in a repair shop, those kinds of mistakes can get someone hurt. David sat me down one afternoon and told me I needed to get my head straight because this job was dangerous when you weren't paying attention. I promised him I'd be more careful, but honestly, I don't know how I was supposed to focus when my entire life was falling apart. Then Emma got sick, and that's when everything went from hard to impossible. I woke up at 3 in the morning to her screaming, and when I went into her room, she was burning up with fever. I grabbed the thermometer with shaking hands, and it read 102.5. I just stood there, panicking, because I had no idea what to do. I called Sarah, even though it was the middle of the night, and she answered on the second ring, like she'd been waiting for something like this to happen. She told me to give Emma some infant fever medicine and keep her hydrated. But when I checked an hour later, the fever hadn't gone down at all. Emma was pulling at her ear and crying in this way that made my chest hurt. Sarah said we needed to go to urgent care right now. We drove through empty streets at 3:30 in the morning with Emma crying in her car seat, and I kept thinking about how Chloe should have been here for this. This was the kind of moment where you need two parents, where you need someone to tell you it's going to be okay while you're driving 70 miles an hour trying not to completely lose it. The urgent care doctor checked Emma's ears and said she had an infection, wrote us a prescription for antibiotics, and charged me a $140 copay that I barely had in my account. I paid it anyway, because what else was I going to do? And we drove home, with Emma finally quiet in her car seat, and me feeling like I just survived something I shouldn't have had to survive alone. That's when I started really looking at our finances. And what I found made me sick. Chloe had been spending money like she was on vacation, and not like she'd abandoned her family. I saw charges for fancy hotels, restaurants I couldn't even pronounce, and multiple ATM withdrawals for cash that added up to thousands of dollars. I logged into our shared email account looking for bank statements, and that's when I found something that changed everything. There were flight confirmation emails and hotel bookings going back to September, back when Chloe was still pregnant with Emma. She'd been planning this trip for over a year, watching me work overtime and stress about money while she was secretly booking plane tickets and European hotels. I took screenshots of everything and added them to my evidence folder. Then I sent them to a family lawyer my buddy from work had recommended. The lawyer responded within an hour and said these were exactly the kind of documents we needed. "This shows clear premeditation and abandonment," he wrote back. "We can use this." Chloe finally called me about 2 weeks after she left. Her voice had this fake sweetness to it that made my skin crawl. She said she missed me and missed Emma, and she asked how we were doing, like she was calling from a business trip and not from a month-long European vacation she'd planned in secret. I could hear people laughing in the background and music playing. And she had the nerve to tell me she was finding herself and healing from everything she'd been through. I asked her what exactly she'd been through, and she immediately switched from sweet to defensive. She said I was making her feel guilty for taking care of her mental health, and she said I was being controlling by questioning her decisions. I cut her off and told her that when she got back to the States, she'd be speaking to my lawyer and not to me. "You can't do that," she said, and I could hear the panic in her voice. "I'm her mother." I told her she should have thought about that before she left. And then I hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt this weird sense of power, because I'd finally stopped letting her manipulate me. I opened a new bank account the next day and had my paycheck deposited there instead of our joint account. I left just enough money in the joint account to cover our bills and Emma's expenses, but everything else went into my personal account where Chloe couldn't touch it. I documented every dollar I spent on Emma and every dollar Chloe wasted in Europe, and the difference was staggering. While I was buying diapers and formula and paying for urgent care visits, she was dropping $800 on a single dinner in Portugal. My lawyer loved this, because it showed exactly what kind of person we were dealing with, and he said any judge would see right through her act. Then Emily sent me something that made my blood boil. Emily was one of Chloe's friends, and honestly, I didn't know her that well, but she'd been quietly watching everything unfold on social media, and I guess she finally had enough. She sent me a message out of nowhere with a photo attached. And when I opened it, I felt my stomach drop. It was a photo of Chloe in Portugal with some guy's hand on her thigh. They were sitting at an outdoor restaurant, looking out at the ocean, and Chloe had this huge smile on her face like she didn't have a care in the world. Emily's message just said, "Thought you should see this. I'm sorry." I saved the photo immediately and sent it to my lawyer with the subject line, Exhibit D. He called me 10 minutes later and said this was exactly what we needed to prove she'd abandoned our family for another relationship. I felt sick looking at that photo, not because I still had feelings for Chloe, but because it confirmed everything I'd suspected. This whole trip wasn't about finding herself or healing. It was about running away with some guy she'd probably been seeing for months. Work started suffering because I was so exhausted and distracted. David pulled me aside again to tell me I'd been late 3 times that week and that wasn't acceptable. He said he wanted to help me, but I was becoming a liability, and if I couldn't get my act together, he'd have to write me up officially. I explained everything that was going on, and he looked at me for a long moment before telling me about his buddy, Kevin, who did weekend deck building and needed an extra set of hands. The pay was $200 for a Saturday, cash under the table, and I jumped at it because I needed every dollar I could get. So, I started spending my Saturdays building decks and my weeknights taking care of Emma. I was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, but at least I was covering our expenses. Meanwhile, Chloe was posting photos from Spain and burning through another $800 on shopping and wine tours. My lawyer called me on a Friday afternoon and asked if I could come to his office right away. I called Sarah and asked if she could watch Emma for an hour, and she said she'd be right over. When I sat down across from my lawyer, he spread all my evidence out on his desk like he was presenting a case to a jury. The notebook, the bank statements, the screenshots, the photo from Portugal, all of it. He looked at me and said, "I can file for emergency custody right now." He explained that based on everything I documented, a judge would very likely grant me temporary sole custody before Chloe even landed back in the United States. He said the evidence of abandonment was overwhelming, and combined with the financial irresponsibility and the adultery, we had a case that practically argued itself. I sat there staring at all those documents and realized this was the moment everything changed. I looked at my lawyer and said, "File it." He nodded and started pulling up forms on his computer, and I walked out of that office knowing that Chloe's European vacation was about to end very differently than she'd planned. The emergency custody hearing happened on a Monday morning while Chloe was still somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, flying back from Europe. I sat in that courthouse wearing the only dress shirt I owned, and my lawyer laid out every single piece of evidence we'd collected over the past 5 weeks. The judge was this older woman who looked like she'd seen every terrible parent story there was to see, and she barely reacted as my lawyer showed her the text messages, the bank statements, the notebook, and the photo from Portugal. When he finished presenting everything, the judge looked down at the papers for what felt like forever before she finally spoke. She said that based on the evidence of parental abandonment, financial irresponsibility, minimal contact with the child, and infidelity during the marriage, she was granting me temporary sole custody of Emma effective immediately. Then she said something that made my heart race. She was also granting me exclusive use of our apartment because Emma needed stability, and I was the primary leaseholder who'd been maintaining the home. Chloe couldn't legally come back there, even though her name was on the lease as a co-tenant. I walked out of that courthouse with official documents in my hand, and for the first time in over a month, I felt like I could actually breathe. The first thing I did was change the locks on our apartment. I called a locksmith that same afternoon and had him install new deadbolts on both doors. And I only made 2 copies of the keys, one for me and one for Sarah. Then I started packing up Chloe's stuff. I was really careful about it, because I knew she'd try to claim I destroyed her things or stole from her. I folded every piece of clothing, wrapped her picture frames in newspaper, and packed everything into boxes that I labeled and dated. I took photos of every box before I sealed it up so there'd be proof that I treated her belongings with respect. I stacked all the boxes in the corner of the living room and put the custody order on top, where she'd see it the second she walked in. If she walked in. Chloe's flight landed on a Thursday evening. I knew because she'd posted about it on social media with some caption about coming home to reality. I was feeding Emma dinner when I heard a key turning in the lock. And then I heard Chloe swear loudly when the key didn't work. She must have taken her apartment key with her to Europe, and now she was finding out the hard way that it was useless. She started pounding on the door and yelling my name, and I just sat there with Emma, finishing her mashed carrots, like nothing was happening. Chloe kept pounding and eventually started screaming that she was going to call the police if I didn't open the door right now. So, I let her call them. 2 cops showed up about 20 minutes later, and I opened the door with the custody order in my hand and Emma on my hip. Chloe immediately started talking about how this was her apartment and I'd illegally locked her out, but one of the cops asked to see the court documents. He read through the custody order and the exclusive use clause. Then he turned to Chloe and told her this was a civil matter and she needed to contact her lawyer. "You can't be serious," she said, and I could see her face turning red. "This is my home." The cop just repeated that it was a civil matter and they couldn't force me to let her in. And then they left. Chloe stood in the hallway, staring at me like she couldn't believe this was happening, and I closed the door without saying a single word. She hired a lawyer within 2 days and filed a motion to vacate the emergency custody order. Her argument was that she'd been dealing with mental health issues and needed a break to recover, and that I was being controlling and vindictive by keeping her away from her daughter. She claimed the trip to Europe was therapeutic and that she'd been in contact with me the whole time, which was such an obvious lie that even her lawyer must have known it was garbage. The hearing for her motion was set for 3 weeks later, and my lawyer told me to just keep doing exactly what I'd been doing because the evidence spoke for itself. So, I kept working, kept taking care of Emma, kept documenting everything in my notebook. Chloe tried calling me a dozen times, and I never answered. She sent text messages ranging from apologetic to threatening, and I screenshotted every single one and added them to my evidence folder. The hearing was worse than the first one because Chloe was actually there this time. She showed up wearing this expensive dress she must have bought in Europe, and she cried while her lawyer talked about how much she loved Emma and how she just needed time to heal from postpartum issues. My lawyer let her talk, and then he stood up and presented the evidence, the bank statements showing her spending thousands on vacation while I paid for urgent care, the social media posts about being finally free while I was doing midnight feedings, the photo with another man in Portugal, the flight confirmations proving she'd planned this for over a year, and the phone records showing she called me exactly 4 times in 5 weeks, and 2 of those calls were to yell at me for filing for custody. The judge listened to everything, and you could see her expression getting colder and colder. When both lawyers finished, the judge denied Chloe's motion completely. She said the temporary custody order would remain in place. Chloe would be allowed supervised visitation only at a court-approved facility, and we'd have a final hearing in 6 months to determine permanent custody. Chloe's lawyer tried to argue, but the judge just said her decision was final and moved on to the next case. 6 months passed, and life actually started feeling normal again. Emma grew and started saying more words, and our apartment became a real home instead of just a place where we survived. I kept working at the shop and doing weekend jobs with Kevin, and slowly, I started building up some savings. Sarah still came over twice a week to help out, and she'd become like family to both me and Emma. And then I met Sophia. She was Kevin's sister, and she stopped by one Saturday while we were building a deck to drop off lunch for her brother. She saw me, covered in sawdust, trying to entertain Emma during our break, and she just sat down and started playing with her like it was the most natural thing in the world. We started talking, and I found out she was a kindergarten teacher who actually liked kids, which felt like a miracle. After everything with Chloe, we went out for coffee a few times, and she never pushed me to move faster than I was ready to move. She understood that Emma came first and that I had a lot of baggage to work through. Emma's 2nd birthday was on a Saturday, and I decided to have a small party at our apartment with just a few people. David came with his wife. Kevin brought Sophia, and Sarah showed up with a homemade cake that Emma immediately tried to grab with both hands. We were all sitting around, watching Emma open presents, when someone knocked on the door, and I already knew who it was before I opened it. Chloe was standing there, holding a wrapped present, and she clearly hadn't been invited. The supervised visitation order meant she was only supposed to see Emma at a court-approved facility with a supervisor present. But here she was, showing up at my apartment like the rules didn't apply to her. She pushed past me into the apartment and stopped dead when she saw Sophia holding Emma. "Who is that?" she said, and her voice had this edge to it that I remembered from our worst fights. I told her she needed to leave right now because she was violating the court order and she wasn't welcome here. She ignored me and walked over to Sophia, and I saw Sarah stand up like she was ready to physically remove Chloe if necessary. Chloe started talking about how she was Emma's mother and she had a right to be at her daughter's birthday. But then she made a mistake. She looked at Emma and said, "This is all your fault," in this voice that made everyone in the room go silent. "If I hadn't gotten pregnant," she said, and she was crying now, but it wasn't sad crying. It was angry crying. "You ruined everything." Nobody moved. David's wife put her hand over her mouth. And Sarah looked like she wanted to hit Chloe. Sophia just held Emma closer and turned away like she was shielding her from whatever was about to happen next. I walked over to Chloe and told her to get out right now. And when she didn't move, I looked at Kevin, and he understood immediately. He's a big guy. And he stood up and walked toward the door. And that was enough to make Chloe finally leave. She grabbed her present and walked out, crying, and I closed the door behind her and locked it. I turned back to the room, and everyone was staring at me, and I realized they'd all just witnessed exactly who Chloe really was. My lawyer had told me that judges take parental rejection very seriously, especially when there are witnesses. And now I had 5 people who'd heard her blame a 2-year-old child for ruining her life. After that day, I filed to terminate even her supervised visitation rights. Honestly, I don't think anyone who was in that room would have blamed me. The final custody hearing happened 2 months later, and this time I brought witness statements from everyone who'd been at that birthday party. David and his wife, Kevin, Sarah, and even Sophia all wrote down exactly what they had heard Chloe say to Emma. My lawyer presented everything, along with evidence that she'd violated the visitation order by showing up at my apartment uninvited. The judge read through the statements and looked at Chloe like she was seeing her for the first time. And then she granted me full legal and physical custody of Emma. Chloe's parental rights weren't terminated, but her visitation was reduced to supervised visits twice a month, and even those could be suspended if she missed payments or violated any more court orders. I walked out of that courthouse knowing that Emma was finally safe, and that Chloe couldn't just waltz back into our lives whenever she felt like it. Emma's 3 now, and she's this amazing kid who loves dinosaurs and refuses to eat anything green. She doesn't remember her mother leaving, and she definitely doesn't remember that birthday party. Sometimes she asks about the lady in the photos, and I just tell her that some people aren't ready to be parents, and that's okay, because she's got plenty of people who love her. She's got me, and Sarah, and Sophia, who's been in our lives for over a year now and treats Emma like she's her own. Chloe sends child support payments most months, but I haven't seen her in person since that birthday party. I heard through Emily that she's still with that guy from Portugal, and honestly, I hope she's happy because it means she's leaving us alone. Kids don't remember the people who left. They remember the people who stayed. And in the end, that's all that really matters. What do you think about the choices I made?